Chapter 5. The Storms of Life. Life has a way of scattering people like autumn leaves in a storm. Thomas left for State College in September 1951, carrying with him Rose's letters, Edward's well wishes, and dreams of a future that seemed bright and certain. He threw himself into his studies with characteristic enthusiasm, joining business clubs, making connections, building the foundation for the life his father had planned for him. Rose began her studies at the Teachers' College. She wrote to Thomas nearly every day long, thoughtful letters full of her observations, her struggles with particularly difficult students during practice, teaching, her hopes for the future they'd build together. She wrote to Edward too, though less frequently. Her letters to him were different, more philosophical, touching on books she was reading, ideas she was wrestling with, questions about life and purpose. Edward treasured each one, reading them multiple times before carefully filing them away in a wooden box he'd built himself. Edward remained in town, working with his uncle. Word of his skills spread. People began requesting him specifically for their projects. He built cabinets, repaired roof beams, crafted furniture. His work was characterized by an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Every joint perfectly fitted, every surface smooth as glass, every piece built to last generations. "You work like a man trying to forget something," his uncle observed one day. Edward didn't respond. What could he say? The wedding took place on a perfect June day in 1954. The ceremony was held at the church in town, but the reception, at Rose's insistence, was held in the meadow beneath the oak tree. White ribbons hung from the branches. Chairs were set up in neat rows on the grass. A local quartet played gentle music as guests arrived. Edward stood beside Thomas at the altar as his best man, wearing a suit he'd saved for months to afford. He watched Rose walk down the makeshift aisle on her father's arm, radiant in a simple white dress she and her aunt had sewn together. He watched Thomas's face as he saw her, the pure, undisguised love shining there. He listened as they spoke their vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life brought them. He handed Thomas the ring. When the moment came, his hands steady, his face composed, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Edward applauded with everyone else, his smile never wavering. During the reception, he danced with Rose for one song, the traditional dance between the bride and the best man. As they moved to the music, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being who you are. For loving him enough to—" She paused. "For being such a good friend." Edward's throat tightened. "He's lucky to have you." "We're both lucky to have you," she replied. When the song ended, Edward bowed slightly, handed her back to Thomas, and retreated to the edge of the gathering. He stood near the oak tree, his hand on its trunk, watching the celebration continue without him. The tree's bark was rough beneath his palms, solid, enduring, unchanged. He found comfort in that constancy. Then came 1955, and everything changed again. The Korean War had technically ended in 1953, but military tensions remained high. The draft was still active, and Edward's number came up that spring. He didn't fight it. In some ways, he welcomed it. The idea of leaving town, of putting distance between himself and the life he'd chosen to step away from, felt like a relief. His mother cried when he told her. His uncle tried to get him an exemption. His carpentry skills were needed after all. But Edward declined the help. Thomas and Rose, who'd just discovered she was pregnant with their first child, were devastated. "You can't go," Thomas protested when Edward broke the news. They were sitting beneath the oak tree, the three of them together, for what might be the last time in years. "Let me talk to my father. He has connections. We can find a way." "No," Edward said firmly. "It's my duty. Other men are going. Why should I be exempt?" "Because we need you here," Rose said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "The baby, you should be here when the baby comes." Edward smiled gently. "I'll be back before you know it. And you'll write to me, won't you? Tell me all about the little one." They promised they would. Edward shipped out that June. Basic training was brutal, 8 weeks of physical exhaustion, mental stress, and learning how to be a soldier. But Edward welcomed the challenge. It gave him something to focus on besides the life he'd left behind. After basic training, he was stationed in Germany, part of the ongoing military presence in post-war Europe. It wasn't combat, but it wasn't peaceful either. The Cold War cast long shadows, and tensions with the Soviet Union kept everyone on edge. Edward served with quiet competence. He didn't seek glory or recognition. He did his job, followed orders, and kept his head down. His carpentry skills proved useful. He was often assigned to construction and repair projects on the base. The letters from home kept him anchored. Thomas wrote regularly cheerful, optimistic letters, full of news about the bank, about Rose's pregnancy, about improvements he was making to the little house they'd bought on Elm Street. His handwriting was messy, enthusiastic, covering the pages with barely contained energy. "Eddie, you won't believe how big Rose has gotten. The doctor says the baby's healthy and strong. We're hoping for a boy, but honestly, I don't care as long as everyone's healthy. Rose has been having cravings for pickles and ice cream, not together, thank God, but at all hours of the day and night. The house is coming together nicely. I've been trying to fix that back porch, but I'm nowhere near as skilled as you. I think I've hammered my thumb more than I've hammered nails. Rose says we should just wait until you come home to do it properly. Work at the bank is good. Father's been showing me the ropes, preparing me to eventually take over. Some days I miss the freedom of college, but most days I'm grateful for the stability. Especially now, with the baby coming. We miss you, brother. The oak tree isn't the same without you. Come home safe." Thomas. Rose's letters were different, longer, more contemplative, filled with observations about life, motherhood, and the changes she was experiencing. "Dear Edward, I've been thinking a lot about transformation lately. How becoming a mother is changing me in ways I didn't expect. Not just physically, though that's certainly dramatic enough, but internally. I feel older somehow, more aware of time, passing, of legacy, of the weight of responsibility. Thomas is wonderful. He talks to my belly every night, telling the baby stories about his childhood, about his adventures with you. He wants our child to know about the oak tree, about the friendship that shaped him. You're going to be Uncle Edward, you know. This child will grow up hearing stories about you. I worry about you over there in Germany. I know you probably can't tell us much about what you're doing, but I pray every night that you're safe. The world feels precarious right now, but then I feel the baby move inside me, and I remember that life continues. New life, new hope. Your mother stopped by yesterday. She's doing well but misses you terribly. I promised her I'd make sure you know you're thought of daily. So consider yourself officially informed you're thought of, Edward Mitchell, more than you probably realize. Write when you can. Tell us you're all right. With affection, Rose. Edward kept every letter. He'd read them in his bunk at night, sometimes multiple times, trying to picture the life continuing without him. Thomas excited about fatherhood, Rose growing round with child, the town changing and staying the same. He wrote back faithfully. To Thomas, he wrote about military life, about Germany, about the men he served with. He kept his tone light, brotherly, never mentioning the loneliness or the strange relief he felt at being so far away. To Rose, he wrote differently. He'd tell her about books he'd found in the base library, about philosophical questions that kept him up at night, about the beauty of the German countryside when he occasionally got leave to explore it. Dear Rose, I've been reading Tolstoy War and Peace. It seemed appropriate given my current situation. There's a passage where Pierre realizes that we can only really understand our lives in retrospect, that while we're living them, we're often blind to the larger patterns and meanings. I think about that a lot these days. Congratulations on the baby. A daughter. Thomas tells me you've named her Elizabeth. That's beautiful. I'm sorry I wasn't there to meet her, to see you both navigate this new adventure, but I'm glad Thomas has you, and you have him. Some things turn out exactly as they should, don't you think? Germany is cold in winter. Not just the temperature, though, that's brutal enough, but something in the atmosphere. The war ended 10 years ago, but you can still feel its ghost everywhere. In the ruins that haven't been fully rebuilt, in the eyes of older Germans who remember, in the tension between East and West. But there's beauty too. Last week, I had leave and visited a small village in Bavaria. There was a church there, built in the 1300s, still standing despite everything. I thought of our oak tree, how some things endure despite wars and time and human foolishness. Tell Elizabeth her Uncle Edward is thinking of her. I'll be home eventually to teach her how to climb trees properly, the way Thomas and I learned as boys. Yours in friendship, Edward. The months stretched into years. Edward re-enlisted once, then again. His mother pleaded with him to come home. His uncle wrote that there was plenty of work waiting. Thomas and Rose added their voices to the chorus, but Edward stayed away. He told himself it was duty, that the army needed him, that he was making a difference. The truth was more complicated. Distance provided protection from his feelings, from watching Thomas and Rose build the life he'd once imagined for himself, from the daily reminder of his sacrifice. In 1958, Rose had a son. They named him James, after Thomas's father. Edward sent a handmade cradle, intricate, beautiful, built during long evening hours on the base. Rose's thank you letter made him cry. In 1960, Edward finally came home. He'd served 5 years. He was 30 years old, harder than when he'd left, weathered by military life and emotional exile. His mother barely recognized him at the train station. His uncle clapped him on the back and declared him a hero, though Edward had done nothing heroic. Thomas met him at the house that evening. They embraced like brothers, and for a moment it was like no time had passed at all. "Come meet the family," Thomas insisted. "The kids have heard so much about you. Elizabeth keeps asking when Uncle Edward is coming home." Edward followed Thomas to the house on Elm Street. It was a lovely home white clapboard, black shutters, a porch that still needed finishing but was serviceable. A child's bicycle lay in the yard. Flowers bloomed in neat beds along the walkway. The door opened and there was Rose. She was 30 now, no longer the girl Edward had fallen in love with beneath the oak tree. Motherhood had changed her, made her softer in some ways, stronger in others. Her hair was shorter, practical. A few lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes. She was still beautiful. "Edward," she said, her voice warm with genuine affection. "Welcome home." A small girl peeked from behind her skirts. Elizabeth, 6 years old, with Thomas's blue eyes and Rose's thoughtful expression. "Don't be shy," Rose encouraged. "This is Uncle Edward we've been telling you about." Edward crouched down to the girl's level. "Hello, Elizabeth. I hear you're quite the reader." She nodded solemnly. "Mama teaches me. I can read chapter books now." "That's very impressive." A toddler appeared, then James, running on unsteady legs, crashing into Thomas's knees. Thomas scooped him up with practiced ease. "This is your Uncle Edward, buddy. The one who made your cradle." James stuck his thumb in his mouth and regarded Edward with serious eyes. They had dinner together. Rose had made pot roast. She remembered it was Edward's favorite. The children chattered. Thomas told stories. Rose laughed at his jokes. It was warm and domestic, and everything a family should be. And Edward sat at their table, smiled at their jokes, played with their children, and felt his heart breaking all over again, because he'd been gone 5 years and nothing had changed. He still loved Rose, he still loved Thomas, and they still had the life he'd stepped aside to give them. After dinner, while Rose put the children to bed, Thomas and Edward sat on that unfinished porch, looking out at the darkening street. "I'm glad you're home," Thomas said. "It's been too long. I've missed my best friend. I've missed you too. You'll stay now, right? No more running off to play soldier. Uncle Sam's had enough of your time." Edward was quiet for a moment. "I'm not running anywhere. I'm home for good." "Good," Thomas said with satisfaction, "because Rose and I have been talking. The kids need a proper uncle around, someone to teach them things, someone who's family." Family. The word hit Edward like a physical blow, because that's what he was to them, family. Brother, uncle, friend, never what he wanted to be, never what he'd dreamed of. But it was enough. It had to be enough. "I'll be here," Edward promised, "for as long as you need me." Thomas smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what I wanted to hear." Later, as Edward walked back to his mother's house through the quiet streets of the town he'd grown up in, he found himself drawn to the meadow. The oak tree stood where it always had, eternal, unchanging. He could see the faint scars where he and Thomas had carved their initials all those years ago. The bark had grown over them slightly, but they were still there. Edward placed his hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark, the solid strength of it. "I kept my promise," he whispered to the tree. "I stayed away like I should have. I let them build their life. I did the right thing." The tree offered no answer, just the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Edward stood there for a long time, saying goodbye to the young man he'd been, to the dreams he'd harbored, to the life he'd chosen not to pursue. When he finally walked away, his shoulders were straighter. His jaw was set. He would build a good life here, a meaningful life. He'd be the best uncle those children could ask for, the best friend Thomas deserved, an honorable man who'd made hard choices and lived with them without complaint. It wasn't the life he'd wanted, but it was the life he'd chosen, and he would make it count. Chapter 6. The Empty Chair. Time has a way of moving slowly until suddenly you look up and decades have passed. Edward settled back into life in town. He took over his uncle's carpentry business when the old man retired. He built furniture and houses and became known as the best craftsman for 3 counties. His work was sought after. People would wait months for an Edward Mitchell original. He never married. People asked, of course. Well-meaning friends tried to set him up with available women. His mother, before she passed in 1972, gently pressed him about finding someone, giving her grandchildren. "I'm married to my work," he'd say with a smile. "And besides, I've got Thomas's kids to spoil. That's enough family for me." It was partially true. Elizabeth and James adored their Uncle Edward. He taught them carpentry, showed them how to identify trees, told them stories of their father's childhood adventures. When Rose had a 3rd child, a daughter, they named Sarah Edward, built her a dollhouse so intricate and beautiful that Rose cried when she saw it. He spent nearly every Sunday at Thomas and Rose's house. Family dinners became routine. He'd sit at their table, play with the children, help Thomas with household repairs, and pretend his heart didn't ache every time he saw Rose smile at her husband. The years accumulated like dust on old furniture. Elizabeth grew up and became a teacher like her mother. James went into business like his father. Sarah became a nurse. Thomas took over the bank and ran it successfully. Rose taught 3rd grade for 30 years, shaping young minds with patience and wisdom. And Edward built things, beautiful, lasting things. He poured all his unexpressed love into his work, every dovetail joint, every smoothed edge, every piece of furniture that would outlast him by generations. He and Thomas still met beneath the oak tree sometimes, though less frequently as the years passed and life got busy. They'd sit on the bench someone had installed there in the 1970s and talk about old times, about their children, Thomas's biological, Edward's adopted in spirit, about the changes in the town and the world. "Remember when we carved our initials?" Thomas asked one afternoon. They were both in their 60s now, gray-haired and slower moving. "Of course. We promised we'd come back as old men." Thomas laughed. "Well, we made it. We're officially old men now. Speak for yourself." "I'm distinguished." They sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the sky like they had as boys. Eddie, Thomas said eventually, his tone more serious. Can I tell you something? Always. My life. It turned out better than I ever imagined. Rose, the kids, the grandkids now, the business, everything. He paused. I know I don't say this enough, but you've been a huge part of that. You've been there for every important moment. You've been more than a friend. You've been a brother. Edward felt his throat tighten. You've been the same for me. Have I, though? Thomas turned to look at him. You never married. You never had your own family. Sometimes I wonder if being so close to mine kept you from building your own life. Don't be ridiculous. I chose the life I wanted. Did you? The question hung between them. Edward carefully considered his answer. Yes, he said finally. I did. Every life requires choices, Thomas. I made mine. I have no regrets. It was a lie. He had one enormous regret. But that regret was also his greatest source of pride, that he'd loved selflessly enough to let go. Thomas seemed satisfied with the answer. Well, I'm grateful anyway, for everything you've been to us. That gratitude goes both ways. They sat until the sun began to set. Two old friends, fulfilling the promise they'd made as boys. Then came 2015. Edward was 78 years old. Thomas was 79. They'd both slowed down, considerably, walking with canes, fighting various health issues, coming to terms with mortality. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October. It was Rose, her voice tight with controlled panic. Edward, you need to come to the hospital. It's Thomas. He's had a heart attack. Edward drove faster than he probably should have. His hands shook on the steering wheel. Not Thomas. Please, not Thomas. At the hospital, he found Rose in the waiting room with her children, Elizabeth, James, and Sarah, all middle-aged now with families of their own. Their faces told him everything he needed to know. How bad? He asked. Bad, Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. They're doing everything they can, but they waited. Hours that felt like years. Doctors came and went with updates that were medical jargon, covering a simple truth: Thomas was dying. Finally, they were allowed to see him. Thomas lay in the hospital bed, tubes and wires, connecting him to machines, his face pale but peaceful. He opened his eyes when they entered. Rose, he whispered. Kids. They gathered around him. Rose held his hand. The children touched his arms, his shoulders. Everyone crying, trying to be strong, failing. Then Thomas's eyes found Edward. Eddie, you came. Of course I came, you idiot. Where else would I be? Thomas smiled weakly. The oak tree. You remember? I remember. We kept our promise. Two old men. Just like we said. We did. We absolutely did. You take care of them, of Rose and the kids. Promise me. Edward moved closer, placing his hand over Thomas's. I promise. But you're not going anywhere. You're too stubborn. Thomas's smile faded. His breathing became more labored. Eddie, best friend, my whole life. Love you. Brother, I love you too, Thomas. Thomas squeezed Rose's hand once more, looked at each of his children, and then his eyes closed. The machines started beeping. Nurses rushed in. The family was ushered out. 20 minutes later, a doctor emerged with the news they already knew. Thomas William Harrison had passed away. The funeral was held on Saturday. The church overflowed with mourners. Thomas had been beloved in the community, respected, admired, the kind of man who'd made a difference in countless quiet ways. Edward delivered the eulogy. He stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and spoke about the boy he'd met when they were 6 years old, about a friendship that had spanned 7 decades, about loyalty and laughter and a promise kept. He didn't mention Rose. He didn't talk about sacrifice or unrequited love. Some stories are too private for public telling. After the service, after most people had left, Edward found himself walking toward the meadow. His cane sank into the soft grass with each step. His knees ached. But he had to go. The oak tree stood where it always had. Edward sat on the bench beneath it, the same bench where he'd sat with Thomas countless times. He looked up at the branches, now mostly bare in the autumn chill. "We made it," he said aloud, "just like we promised." 2 old men beneath the oak tree. But he was alone now, for the first time in his life, truly alone. He thought about all the choices he'd made, the love he'd hidden, the life he'd let slip away, the decades of silent devotion to a woman who was never his, and a friend who never knew the full truth. Had it been worth it? He looked at the carved initials, still faintly visible, after more than 60 years. Yes, he decided, it had been worth it. Because Thomas had lived a happy life, because Rose had been loved well, because their children had grown up secure and whole, because a promise made by 2 boys had been kept by 2 old men. Some loves are meant to be acted upon. Others are meant to be carried silently, like a torch lighting the way for others. Edward had carried his torch well. As the sun set and the autumn wind whispered through the bare branches, Edward felt something shift. Not peace exactly, more like completion. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd been the friend Thomas deserved. He'd loved from a distance with honor and dignity. He'd lived a good life, if not the life he'd once imagined. "Rest well, old friend," he whispered. "I'll see you again someday, and we'll sit beneath this tree and laugh about it all." The tree creaked in the wind, as if acknowledging his words. Edward sat there until darkness fell, saying goodbye to his best friend, to his youth, to the life that might have been. When he finally rose to leave, his movements were slow and painful, but his back was straight. He'd kept his promises, all of them, and that, in the end, was enough. Chapter 7. The Reunion. 5 years passed, like water flowing under a bridge, inevitable, continuous, carrying everything forward. Edward was 83 now. His body was failing in the way bodies do: arthritis, fading eyesight, a heart that sometimes skipped beats. But his mind remained sharp, his hands still capable of delicate work. Though he rarely did carpentry anymore, he'd become something of a town fixture. The old bachelor who'd never married, who'd been Thomas Harrison's best friend, who'd devoted his life to his craft and to a family that wasn't quite his own. People spoke of him with affection and a touch of pity. They didn't understand why such a good man had never found love. They whispered theories: a lost love from the war, commitment issues, simply being too particular. None of them guessed the truth. Rose had aged into a graceful older woman. Widowhood had changed her, added a layer of quiet sadness to her demeanor, but she remained active. She volunteered at the library, spent time with her grandchildren, tended a beautiful garden. She and Edward saw each other occasionally at family gatherings, church events, chance meetings at the grocery store. Their interactions were always warm, but tinged with something unspoken, a shared history that neither fully acknowledged. Then came a day in late spring, 5 years after Thomas's death. Edward woke that morning with an overwhelming urge to visit the oak tree. He couldn't explain it, just a pull, like an invisible thread connecting him to that place. He made his slow way to the meadow, leaning heavily on his cane, stopping several times to catch his breath. His doctor would scold him for walking this far at his age, but some things were more important than medical advice. The oak tree was in full bloom, leaves bright green, the grass beneath it studded with wildflowers. It was one of those perfect spring days that makes you remember why life is beautiful. Edward settled onto the bench with a groan of relief. His joints protested, but once seated, he felt a wave of contentment wash over him. He sat there for nearly an hour, watching birds flit through the branches, listening to the breeze rustle the leaves, remembering. Then he heard footsteps. He turned to see Rose making her way across the meadow. She walked slowly, carefully, using a walker for support. Her hair was completely white now, her face lined with age, but her eyes, those warm brown eyes, were unchanged. "I thought I might find you here," she said when she reached him. "Rose." Edward started to rise, but she waved him back down. "Don't get up. These old bones take forever to fold and unfold." She maneuvered herself onto the bench beside him, setting her walker aside. "I woke up this morning thinking about this place, about you and Thomas, about all of us." They sat in silence for a moment, two old people who'd known each other for more than 60 years, comfortable in each other's presence. "The kids have been trying to get me to move into assisted living," Rose said eventually. "They worry about me living alone. Are you going to?" "I don't know. The house holds so many memories. Thomas is in every room, every corner. I don't know if I can leave that." "I understand. Do you?" She turned to look at him directly. "Do you really, Edward?" There was something in her tone, a challenge, perhaps, or an invitation. "What do you mean?" Rose was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her knee. "I've been thinking a lot lately about my life, about the choices I made and the ones I didn't make, about the things that were said and the things that were left unspoken." Edward's heart began to beat faster. "Rose, you loved me," she said softly. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement of fact. Edward's breath caught. After all these years, after decades of careful silence, the truth was finally being spoken aloud. "Yes," he admitted. "I did. I do. I knew," she whispered. "I think I always knew. Even back then, when we were young. The way you looked at me sometimes. The way you stepped aside so Thomas and I could be together. The way you disappeared for 5 years into the army. Thomas never knew." "No, he didn't. Thomas saw the world the way he wanted it to be, bright and simple and good. He couldn't have conceived that you might, that we might." She trailed off, and Edward picked up the thread. I couldn't do that to him, Rose. He was my best friend. He loved you. You loved him. I wasn't going to stand in the way of that. That's a rare kind of love, Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. The kind that sacrifices itself. The kind that asks for nothing. It's the only kind of love I know how to give. Rose reached out and took his hand. Her skin was papery and thin, spotted with age, but her grip was firm. I want you to know something, she said. Thomas gave me a beautiful life. He was a wonderful husband, a devoted father. I loved him deeply, truly, completely. I never regretted marrying him. Not for a single moment. I know. But, she continued, squeezing his hand, I want you to know that I saw you too. I saw your sacrifice. I saw your quiet devotion. I saw you show up year after year, being there for our family, loving us all from a careful distance. That didn't go unnoticed, Edward. It didn't go unappreciated. Tears pricked at Edward's eyes. You don't have to. Yes, I do, because you need to hear it. You've spent your entire life in the shadows, putting everyone else first. You deserve to know that you were seen, that you mattered, that your sacrifice meant something. A tear rolled down Edward's weathered cheek. It meant everything to me that you were happy. I know, and we were happy. But Edward, her voice broke slightly. Sometimes I wonder what life might have been like if things had been different. If you hadn't been so noble, if you'd spoken up, if I'd been braver, would it have changed anything? Rose was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Maybe not. But I think about it sometimes. They sat together, hands clasped, two old souls, finally speaking truths that had been buried for a lifetime. Do you regret it? Rose asked. The life you didn't live? Edward considered the question carefully. I regret not being selfish enough to try. I regret the children I didn't have, the wife who might have been, the different life I could have led. But I don't regret my choice, because my choice gave you and Thomas the chance to build something beautiful. And that mattered more to me than my own happiness. That's love, Rose said softly. Real, true love. Not the kind in fairy tales or romance novels. The kind that costs something. The kind that endures. I suppose it is. They sat together as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meadow. Birds sang their evening songs. The breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and freshly turned earth. Thomas knew at the end, Rose said suddenly. In the hospital, just before he died, when it was just the two of us for a moment. He told me to take care of you. He said you'd given up more than anyone knew. He said you were the best man he'd ever known. Edward couldn't speak. His throat was too tight with emotion. I think he figured it out, Rose continued. Maybe not all at once, but over the years. Little things that didn't quite add up. The way you never married. The way you always found reasons to leave when we were too happy. The way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching. Did it hurt him? To know? I think it broke his heart a little. Not because he was jealous or angry, but because he realized what you'd sacrificed for him. For us. And he couldn't give it back to you. He couldn't undo it. All he could do was be grateful. They sat in silence, processing decades of unspoken truths finally spoken. What do we do now? Edward asked eventually. Rose squeezed his hand again. We do what we've always done. We honor what was. We accept what is. We hold these truths gently and with grace. And what about us? We're friends, Edward. We've always been friends. That hasn't changed. But now we can be friends without secrets, without shadows. We can be honest about what we feel, what we've always felt, and honor it without shame. Edward brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Thank you for seeing me, Rose. For all these years, thank you for seeing me. How could I not? You've been the most constant presence in my life, even more than Thomas in some ways, because you chose to be there. Every single day, you chose us. That kind of devotion doesn't go unnoticed. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they sat together beneath the oak tree, two old people carrying their histories, their loves, their regrets, their triumphs. The tree seemed to lean toward them slightly, as if offering shelter, as if acknowledging the weight of everything it had witnessed over the decades. When they finally rose to leave slowly, painfully, helping each other stand, they paused to look at the trunk where, so long ago, two boys had carved their initials. The initials were barely visible now, grown over by bark and time. But they were still there, still present, still marking that ancient promise. We should add mine, Rose said with a small smile. Complete the trio. It's not too late, Edward replied, but they both knew it was. Some things belong to the past, preserved exactly as they were, held sacred in memory. They walked slowly back toward town together, the oak tree standing watch behind them, holding its secrets, remembering everything. Chapter 8, Full Circle. The following summer arrived with gentle warmth and endless blue skies. Edward knew somehow that it would be his last. He wasn't afraid. Death, when you've lived as long and as fully as he had, loses its terror. It becomes simply the next chapter, the natural conclusion to a story well told. He'd tied up loose ends. His will was in order, leaving his tools to Thomas's grandson, who'd shown an interest in carpentry, his modest savings divided among Thomas and Rose's children, his house to be sold with proceeds going to the local library. But there was one more thing he needed to do. On a perfect afternoon in late June, the kind of day that seemed designed by God, specifically for remembering, Edward made his way to the meadow one final time. The walk was harder than ever. His breath came in short gasps. His heart fluttered irregularly in his chest. But he pressed on, driven by something deeper than physical strength. The oak tree stood in full summer glory, leaves thick and green, branches spread wide, offering its perpetual embrace. Edward settled onto the bench with a deep sigh of contentment. The pain in his joints faded. The struggle to breathe eased. A profound peace settled over him. He looked up at the branches, remembering. Two boys climbing and laughing and dreaming. A teenage girl reading poetry. Three young people navigating the complicated mathematics of love and friendship. A soldier leaving for war. A wedding beneath these branches. Children playing. An old man sitting in grief. All of it here, all of it held in the memory of this tree. We kept our promise, Edward said aloud. Thomas and I, just like we said. Two old men beneath the oak tree, remembering everything. The breeze whispered through the leaves, almost like an answer. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He thought of Thomas, his brother in all but blood, his best friend across 7 decades. He thought of Rose, his secret love, his constant ache, his quiet joy. He thought about the life he'd lived. Not the life he'd planned, not the life he'd dreamed of, but the life he'd actually lived. It had been a good life, not perfect, full of sacrifice and longing and roads not taken, but good, meaningful, rich in its own way. He'd loved deeply, even if that love was never returned in the way he'd hoped. He'd been loyal to the end. He'd kept his promises. He'd lived with honor and dignity and quiet courage. What more could any person ask? Edward's breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied into a gentle rhythm. The pain that had been his constant companion for years faded away entirely. He felt light, free, at peace. In his mind's eye, he saw Thomas young again, grinning, extending a hand to help him climb to their favorite branch. "Come on, Eddie. We've got the whole summer ahead of us." Edward smiled. "I'm coming," he whispered. And then, as gently as falling asleep on a warm afternoon, Edward Henry Mitchell took his last breath beneath the oak tree. They found him the next morning. A jogger passing through the meadow saw him sitting peacefully on the bench, his head tilted back, a slight smile on his face. Rose was the first they called. She came immediately, stood before him, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Edward," she whispered, "you came home." The funeral was well attended. Edward had lived quietly, but had touched many lives. His craftsmanship was in homes throughout 3 counties. His kindness was remembered by dozens of families he'd helped over the years. Rose spoke at the service. She stood at the podium, this frail but graceful woman in her 80s, and told the truth. Not the whole truth. Some things are still too private. But enough. She spoke of a man who'd loved selflessly, who'd sacrificed his own happiness for others, who'd devoted his life to friendship and family, even when that family wasn't his own, who'd kept promises that most people would have long forgotten. "Edward Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and strong, "was the best man I have ever known. Not because he was perfect, but because when faced with impossible choices, he chose love. He chose honor. He chose others over himself. Every single time." After the service, Rose did something unusual. She placed a single white rose at the base of the oak tree, right next to where she'd placed Thomas's rose 5 years earlier. And then she took a stone, small and smooth, and scratched 3 sets of initials into the bench beneath the tree. 3 lives intertwined. 3 loves, each different but equally real. The oak tree still stands in the meadow. If you visit today, you can sit on the bench beneath it. You can see the faded initials carved into the trunk decades ago. You can feel the peace of the place. And if you're very quiet, if you listen carefully, some say you can hear them 2 old friends, laughing like boys, their promise finally and fully kept. The oak tree remembers. It always remembers. It remembers the boy who loved his friend enough to let go. It remembers the man who chose sacrifice over selfishness. It remembers Edward Henry Mitchell, who lived quietly, loved deeply, and in the end, found his way home. Closing reflection beneath the old oak tree. As we come to the end of this story, I want you to take a moment. Just pause, take a breath, think about the promises you've made in your lifetime, the ones you kept and the ones that slipped away. Think about the people who shaped you, the friendships that defined whole chapters of your life, the loves that changed you, the sacrifices that nobody ever saw. Edward's story isn't just about unrequited love. It's about something deeper, something that perhaps we understand better as we grow older. That love isn't always about possession. Sometimes the deepest love is found not in what we claim, but in what we freely give away. Edward could have been bitter. He could have resented Thomas and Rose. He could have let his pain turn him into someone small and angry. But he didn't. He chose every single day to love them both enough to let them be happy, even if that happiness didn't include him in the way he'd once hoped. That's heroism, not the kind that gets medals or statues, the quiet kind, the kind that costs everything and asks for nothing in return. How many of us have made similar choices? Maybe not as dramatic, but choices nonetheless. Stepping aside so someone else could shine, supporting a friend's dream when we had our own dreams, putting our children's needs before our desires, caring for aging parents when we'd rather be living our own lives. These quiet sacrifices, they're the foundation of love, real love, the kind that endures long after passion fades and romance novels end. And that promise the one Edward and Thomas made as boys, it's beautiful, isn't it? In a world where promises are broken daily, where people ghost each other without explanation, where commitment seems old-fashioned, there's something deeply moving about two boys who kept their word across 70 years. They said they'd return as old men to sit beneath that tree, and they did. One in body, one in spirit, but both present, both faithful to the end. I wonder about that oak tree sometimes. If trees could talk, what stories would they tell? What secrets have they witnessed? What promises have been whispered beneath their branches? That tree saw two boys become men. It saw love bloom and sacrifice made. It saw war separate friends and death reunite them. It stood through everything, storms and droughts, happiness and heartbreak, a silent witness to human lives, unfolding in their beautiful, complicated, messy glory. We all need our oak trees, places where we're rooted, places that remember us, places that hold our history when memory fades, places that connect us to who we were and remind us of who we hope to become. Maybe it's not a tree for you. Maybe it's a park bench, a church pew, a fishing spot, a corner of your childhood home. But we all have them, these places that anchor us to our stories, that whisper to us about continuity and meaning in a world that's constantly changing. Edward died as he lived with dignity, with peace, with his promises kept. And in the end, isn't that what we all hope for? Not necessarily a grand life, but a good one. Not a life free of pain, but a life where that pain meant something, where our sacrifices mattered, where we loved well, even when love cost us everything. Rose saw him. That matters too. For all those years, Edward thought his sacrifice was invisible, that nobody knew what he'd given up. But she saw. She always saw. And at the end, she told him so. Sometimes that's all we need. Just one person who sees us, who recognizes what we've carried, who acknowledges the weight of our choices, not to change anything, not to undo what's done, but simply to say, I see you. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You mattered. If you're listening to this, and you've made your own quiet sacrifices for children, for spouses, for friends, for aging parents, for dreams you let others chase, I want you to know you're seen too. Maybe not by everyone, maybe not by the people you sacrificed for, but your choices mattered. They shaped lives. They changed outcomes. They were love in its purest form. And that oak tree, wherever yours stands, it remembers. As you go about your day to day, I hope you'll think about Edward and Thomas and Rose. I hope you'll remember that friendship is sacred, that promises matter, that love takes many forms, and the quietest forms are often the most powerful. Call an old friend. Visit a place from your past. Tell someone what they meant to you before it's too late. Keep your promises, even the small ones. Choose love, even when it costs you. Because in the end, when we're sitting beneath our own oak trees, looking back on the life we lived, the only thing that will matter is this: did we love well? Did we keep our word? Did we sacrifice something of ourselves so others could flourish? Edward's answer was yes. What will yours be? Thank you for spending this time with me, listening to this story. I hope it touched something in you. I hope it reminded you of your own friendships, your own sacrifices, your own oak trees. May you find peace in the choices you've made. May you have the courage to keep your promises. May you love deeply, sacrifice willingly, and know that you are seen, always seen, even when you feel invisible. And may you, like Edward, return to your oak tree someday older, wiser, weathered by life, and know that you lived with honor, that you loved with your whole heart, and that your story mattered. Beneath the old oak tree, we're all connected by memory, by love, by the promises we keep and the sacrifices we make, by the quiet heroism of simply showing up day after day, year after year, for the people we love. Rest well, Edward Mitchell. Your promise is kept. Your love is honored. Your story is told. And the oak tree stands tall, remembering everything. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may you find your own oak tree, and may it hold your story with the same grace and dignity it held Edward's. Goodbye, my friends, in memory of all who love quietly. The greatest love is not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to put others first, day after day, year after year, with no expectation of recognition or reward. This story is dedicated to the friends who kept their promises, the lovers who sacrificed their happiness for others, the trees that remember what we forget, and everyone who has ever made the hard choice to love from a distance. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to know their quiet sacrifices matter.